Y las moriscas.
Hello, and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a series for IHSHG examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In the last episode, we looked at the first Shia caliphates of the Islamic world in the form of the Fatimids of Egypt. We saw how an exile from an obscure religious sect built a powerful coalition of followers and established a rival caliphate underpinned by the notion that this would be the final great civilization before end times. We also examined how this remarkable state dramatically fell into disarray following the disastrous reign of El-Hakim, and how court rivalries that became increasingly hard to settle, even by the most talented political administrators, caused the state to lapse into cycles of vicious division and short-lived unity, which, when coupled with the changing scene of Islamic politics in the 11th and 12th centuries, ultimately led to the regime's demise. Today, we will examine this change in politics more closely, as we look at the Islamic world in the era of the Crusades. This is a dynamic period, where lots of remarkable changes begin to happen in the Islamic world. The old centers of power in Iberia, Egypt, and Baghdad began to give way to military coalitions of Turkish mercenaries and slave soldiers, who created sizable empires across the Islamic world. The one exception to this, perhaps being Al-Andalus, that was taken over by Berbers from northern Africa. These military coalitions were often quite short-lived, however, with one power rapidly taking over another as the period went on, until the advent of the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, the so-called gunpowder empires of the 15th and 16th centuries. In addition, a golden age of writing and poetry began to come into being, as Persian was revived as a scholarly and literary language, leading to an outpouring of remarkable poetry and prose by some of the biggest names in Islamic literature, people such as Hafez, Rumi, Firdowsi, and the scientist Ibn Sina. Furthermore, the Islamic world by this point had begun to extend its reach even further still, with princes in Southeast Asia and West Africa incorporating Islam into their religious practices. There are therefore plenty of different topics to cover in this period, and so from here on in, our narrative is going to slightly deviate, so that the full range of topics and discussions can be fully addressed in the depth that they deserve. We will start by examining the Islamic world's response to crusading in Europe, a militant religious movement that sought to bring cities of Christian religious significance, such as Antioch and Jerusalem, under the rule of Christendom. Through this lens, we will be able to trace the arc of a dramatic period in Islamic history, where military action and rapid changes in political regime coincided, bizarrely enough, with peaceful trade between Christian and Islamic merchants. In this period, the ailing Abbasid Caliphate was revived by a military coup of its own Turkish soldiers, who created a sizable polity that ruled in the Caliph's name. This coalition, however, waxed and waned as new leaders rose and fell in what was a fairly unstable time, exacerbated by the presence of aggressive Crusader kingdoms on the coast of the Levant and one of the most infamous Shiite sects in all of history in the mountains of Syria. Egypt, too, saw a dramatic change in management, as it went from being a hotbed of political tensions to the base of power of one of the period's most famous figures. This was therefore one of the most dynamic eras in the history of the Islamic world, and I'm excited to share with you today the remarkable narrative of how this played out. Of course, there were plenty more fascinating processes going on outside of the Middle East, and those of you familiar with this period will of course know that crusading wasn't solely focused on the so-called Holy Land in the Middle East, and that other major theatres of crusade existed around Iberia and the Baltic coast. In this episode, I will focus primarily on the Levant and Egypt. The crusading theatre in Iberia, sometimes called the Reconquista, is too large to cover in this episode, and so it will be addressed as a subject in its own right in a later episode. I will also slightly limit the time frame that we will cover in this period, taking us up to the start of Saladin's reign in Egypt, so that this episode doesn't become excessively long, which, given the depth of content we have to examine here, is a very real risk. Even with this more restricted time frame, however, as you're shortly about to see, plenty of fascinating history takes place. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Do be sure to check out their website, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. So, without further ado, let's begin. To understand the build-up to this iconic series of warfare, it's necessary to access the situation in both the Islamic and Christian worlds as the 11th century dawned, to see how these two worlds would come into conflict by the year 1098. At the turn of the second millennium of the Common Era, the once great Abbasid Caliphate lied in ruins. Its eastern holdings in Iran and Central Asia had broken off to form their own independent entities, and its heartland in Iraq was ruled by the deeply unpopular Zangid Dynasty. Furthermore, Syria and Palestine were falling into the hands of an ebullient Fatimid Egypt that was continuing its rapid rise to power after the 970s. In and amongst the tensions caused by the fracturing of Abbasid power, a new coalition began to gain influence. These were the Seljuks, Turkish soldiers from Central Asia who had sold their services to the Abbasids as mercenaries. Interestingly, these were originally Jewish and Christian Turks who converted to Islam to enter into the circles of power that the Abbasids provided. Their original religious beliefs can be glimpsed in the names of some individuals that we know of, names like Moses, Jonah, and Michael, that would imply the existence of Judaism and Christianity before Islam came to the Seljuks. The Seljuks had been recognized about a century earlier as talented soldiers who used a variety of aggressive military tactics that were highly effective in this period. Their classic means of fighting would be to ride in broad circles around the enemy, peppering them with arrows shot rapidly from reflex bows designed to put maximum force behind each arrow shot. The Seljuks would also fake retreats to draw out elements of their enemy's armies, to leave them exposed for renewed bouts of arrow volleys. These were tactics that went back to the very early history of steppe dwellers from Central Asia, and allowed the Seljuks to fight as a powerful, mobile unit that proved hard for armies that relied on infantry or shock cavalry to keep a pace with, right up until the widespread use of firearms and mobile artillery in the 17th century. They were therefore a true asset, although being mercenaries, their services were contingent on a steady stream of reasonable pay. Without a caliph in Baghdad to pay them, the Seljuks had begun to turn to other patrons for employment, who were more keen to make the most of the Seljuks' ferocious fighting power. They were able to take advantage of this situation quickly, however, owing to the fractured nature of post-Abbasid Iran and reliance of city-states on mercenaries to fight. Military service quickly bubbled over into conquest, and by 1055, the Seljuks had overrun many of their former clients and had begun to march on Baghdad. After a siege of a few months, they were welcomed into the city as a refreshing alternative to the Buyids, who had succeeded in isolating many of Baghdad's most influential secular and religious figures. With their recent success and staunchly Sunni stance that they had used to propel themselves to power, they had their eyes on further conquest into the Middle East and beyond. Outside of the Islamic world, major changes were also underfoot. By 1060, almost all of Europe had entered into the fold of Christianity. The papacy in Rome had risen to be a major leading force in religious life, declaring in 1057 that the church sat as a separate entity above the authority of any king. This, combined with an increased use of canon law and papal decretals, allowed the Pope to more centrally direct religious policy in Europe, and cultivated a religious zeal for Christianity across the princes of Europe. Not everyone was satisfied with this arrangement, however. A doctrinal dispute in 1053 with the Orthodox Patriarch of the Byzantine Empire caused the Catholic and Orthodox churches to irrevocably part ways as the Pope and Patriarch mutually excommunicated each other. From here on in, the Catholic kingdoms of Europe and the Byzantine Empire began to view each other with an increased sense of distrust and suspicion, something that would have a major impact when Christian knights began to pour into the Middle East, pursuing Crusade. The Byzantine Empire's problems were beginning to mount as well. The Seljuk success had caused other Turkic groups, such as the Cumans and Pechenegs, to be pushed away from their usual riding targets, forcing them to attack further west to secure loot and tributes that they were used to having. From the 1050s onwards, they had begun to harass Byzantine territories in Eastern Europe, stretching the empire's already overextended military resources. This was compounded by raids in the west coming from the Normans, French knights who had taken over Sicily and Malta, and were keen to expand their fledgling kingdom further across the Mediterranean. Although Byzantium was a significant power in the region, its influence was beginning to fray from these perennial attacks, inviting the possibility of having to turn to their rivals in the west for assistance. The changing fates of these two worlds would eventually create the perfect storm for war to break out between the two. For now, though, the Seljuks appeared to be a stable, successful, and scrappy young dynasty, keen to push further victories they had already achieved and establish themselves as legitimate rulers in the Islamic world. To bolster their legitimacy, they established themselves as staunch defenders of Sunni Islam that would unite and return the Islamic world to orthodoxy, a reassuring idea in the wake of Shia Fatimid conquest and the inept rule of the Buyids, who themselves had sympathies to Shi'ism. This also provided a calling point around which the disparate Turkic groups that formed the Seljuks ranks could unite. The Caliph was allowed to continue as an honorary figurehead to the new dynasty, and the early Seljuk rulers, Tugril Bey and Alp Arslan, gave themselves instead the titles Sultan, a title meaning conqueror, and roughly comparable to king or emperor. That being said, coins were issued in their name, and the khutbah, or imam's sermon during Friday prayers, included prayers for them, an honor traditionally reserved for the caliph alone. Tugril and his successors also took the caliphal titles of Amir al-Mu'minin, or Commander of the Faithful, and Rukn ad-Dawla, Pillar of State. This was in many ways an effective power move. It gave the Seljuks all the formal trappings of a caliph without taking the position itself from its former owners, something that could have seriously disregarded them amongst the elite circles of the Islamic world. To cement their position further in Baghdad, the Seljuks commissioned a large number of poets and artists to commission work to display their power, and appointed Persian political theorists to teach them the art of high statecraft. This was an ideal time to do this, as in Iran, Persian literature and language was being revived in force, and classical styles of poetry and prose were attracting serious commission from patrons keen to weigh in on this new trend that was taking the Islamic world by force. We will explore this in much more depth later on in our series, as it really deserves an episode or two of its own. The result is that a number of manuals, known as Mirrors of Princes, were established, advising in all areas of government. The most famous, perhaps being Nizam el-Mulk's Qabus-Nameh. This is a genuinely fascinating read that covers a highly eclectic number of topics, from managing disloyal advisors to selecting good wazirs, to more ceremonial matters such as hosting banquets and attending the public baths. One chapter is particularly noteworthy, as it encourages young rulers to experiment with both male and female companions to find an ideal lover. This points to an often overlooked fact that in many circles of power in the Islamic world, it was considered entirely natural for same-sex relationships to take place. We will explore this theme further in a later episode, as it's a remarkable element of Persian literature that points to the fact that, in many societies before modernity, LGBT+ relationships were tolerated and even celebrated. Conquest for the Seljuks came thick and fast, taking advantage of structural weaknesses that had erupted in Fatimid Egypt and in the wake of the disastrous caliphate of El-Hakim. They swept further west, establishing a presence in Syria and Palestine in the 1060s and 70s, and then moving up to Anatolia to challenge the Byzantine presence there. In 1071, the Byzantines suffered a terrible defeat at Manzikert in the east of present-day Turkey, and the emperor, Romanus IV Diogenes, suffered the humiliating ritual of prostrating to the Sultan Al-Arslan as his victorious enemy placed his foot on his neck. As terrible as this was, however, the two powers seemed to reconcile rather fast, and worked together to maintain their control over their respective regions. The Seljuks and Byzantines were able to keep Fatimid influence in the region in check, something that was a cause for concern for both of them, and helped each other to counter the raids of independent Turkish warlords, or Ghazis, that had taken advantage of the chaos. This became especially important from 1077 onwards, when a rogue faction at the Seljuk court broke free and established the independent Sultanate of Rum, named after the Arabic name for Byzantium. Sadly, though, this brief period of friendliness was not to last, and a crisis broke out in a way that should by now seem terribly familiar in the study of the medieval Islamic world. In 1092, after the death of the talented Malik Shah, the third Sultan of the Seljuks, his sons broke out in open conflict with each other for control of the Sultanate. In many Turkic circles, this was seen as no bad thing, as the sons of rulers were allowed to fight to allow the most shrewd and aggressive successor to ultimately take the throne. The issue here, though, was that a much larger and more sophisticated state was at stake, and this fight came at the worst possible time. The Byzantines were looking for new allies as Seljuk rule disintegrated, and in Europe, the idea of bringing cities in the Middle East, such as Jerusalem and Antioch, under Christian rule, were already beginning to gain traction, with the Seljuks infighting and the Fatimids once again degenerating into factionalism. There was no united front to prepare for the devastating blow that was about to come. In 1094, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Komnenos called for military aid from the West to help manage the increasingly fraught situation he found his empire caught in. 2 years later, at the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II used that plea for help as the basis for a call to arms. He implored the kings and soldiers of Europe to take over Syria and Palestine, so that they too may be ruled by Christian princes, promising that anyone who went to fight would be relieved of all sin they had accumulated up until that point. This latter part of the message, as Urban's decretal was passed around Europe, eventually was miscommunicated to say that anyone who went on this religious war would receive a guaranteed place in paradise without having to go through the fires of purgatory that would painfully remove remaining sin from believers before they ascended. This was a highly desirable prospect, as the idea of purgatory was becoming more prominent in Catholic belief at the time. From this came the basis for the First Crusade, a Christian religious war driven by the wish to claim the Levant for the Christian world. The first wave of Crusaders were odd, to say the least. a band of peasants, led by a hermit called Peter, who claimed that a goose would lead them to Jerusalem, were the first to set out. They eventually made it to Palestine 2 years after Clermont, where they were cut down in short order by the Seljuks. After that, though, thousands of knights from across Christian Europe set sail to attack the coasts of the Middle East. Still in a state of disarray, the Seljuks were able to offer surprisingly little resistance to the invaders, and by 1101, 4 Christian polities had been established in the Levant: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the counties of Edessa and Tripoli, as well as 2 knightly orders to protect these new fledgling kingdoms: the Knights Hospitaller in Antioch and the Knights Templar in Jerusalem. The conquest of Antioch and Jerusalem were well received in Europe, although strategically, the Crusaders were in a difficult spot. These new polities were a good distance away from other Christian powers in Europe, and were only accessible by lengthy journeys at sea. Flanking them on all angles were hostile powers: the Seljuks in the east, the Fatimids in the south, and Byzantium in the north, that was understandably annoyed at the way that the Crusaders had ignored their initial request and carved out land that was in striking distance of Byzantine territories. The capture of Edessa, too, annoyed the Byzantine court, as this for a while now had been a territory that the Byzantines believed to have been rightly their own. Things weren't helped either by the fact that the Crusaders frequently isolated the Syriac Christian communities that already existed in the territories they took over, who believed in a different creed to the invaders. Although these new kingdoms would show initial signs of strength for the first half of the 12th century, infighting amongst Crusaders and an increasingly strident resistance from the Islamic world would eventually see the downfall of these new territories. It was around this time that another significant group was starting to make headway in the region, especially around the mountains of Aleppo in Syria, whose name has become iconic and synonymous with the infamous activities they carried out: the Hashashin, or as they're more commonly known as, assassins. This was a Shiite sect from northeast Persia, who compensated for their lack of resources or political clout by conducting strings of high-profile murders of prominent political figures to deter any enemies. They established themselves in the castle of Masyaf in the mountains around Aleppo, under the management of the religious leader Rashid ad-Din, known in some sources as the Old Man of the Mountain. The assassins would exist in this period as a minor but highly significant power, and as we will see, the course of both Crusader and Islamic powers in this period was sometimes badly disrupted by untimely visits from this sect, who killed and threatened some of the most important political players in this period. What is perhaps truly interesting about the assassins, though, is where their loyalties tended to lie. Those of you familiar with the Assassin's Creed series of video games might understandably think that this group would have been at odds with the Crusader states and the Knights Templar in Jerusalem. In this instance, however, the truth is odder than fiction. And although an age-long rivalry between the Assassins and Templars makes for a compelling narrative to the iconic series of games, the real-life Assassins were generally on better terms with Crusaders than the Seljuks themselves. Being Shia Muslims, they were far more concerned with the aggressive pro-Sunni stance that the Seljuks put forward than the ambitions of Crusaders, and were not averse to negotiating with, and even helping, Christian princes to undermine their mutual enemy. The regular tribute in gold paid by the Templars to the Assassins to allow them to move through Syria unmolested was also a tidy source of income for the group, and helped to smooth relationships between the two. There is much more to explore about this group, and to that end, I intend to give them a dedicated episode of their own in the future, where I will look at their origins and activities further, and how their name has become so famous into the modern day. Going back to the narrative then, the Crusader kingdoms initially saw some success, with a string of military victories against the still divided Seljuk front from 1101 to 1140. This quickly changed, however, with the rise of an aggressive new military leader by the name of Zangid. Zangid was a Seljuk commander who established a dynasty known as the Zangids in 1125. He successfully united the Seljuks under one banner by rallying them behind the cause of defending Islamic territories from the invaders by holy war, or jihad. Striking out in 1128, he took Aleppo for himself and established it as the capital of his dynasty. In 1144, he went further and overran and destroyed the Crusader garrison in Edessa. After that, he rapidly moved around the major strongpoints of Syria, taking back most of its major cities with the exception of Damascus. After his sudden death in 1148, this work was only continued further by his son, who took the name Nur ad-Din, meaning light of faith. In 1149, Nur ad-Din besieged and took over Antioch, one of the major cities of the Crusader kingdoms, fighting off a joint Crusader and assassin force to take the city. And finally, in 1154, he managed to include Damascus into the fold of Seljuk rule, following a lengthy 2-year siege against a particularly persistent emir who didn't want to give up the famed city. The Second Crusade, that saw attempts to take back the gains lost to Zangid ascendancy, ended in failure and returned the Seljuks to majority rule over the Levant. With his position secured, Nur ad-Din settled down to begin governing his new territory. To preserve peace with the former governor of Damascus, he gave him rulership over the city of Homs. He also unravelled over the course of the 1150s an ambitious building project of markets, hospitals, mosques, and universities to cement his position as a defender of Sunni tradition and ruler to eventually reunite the Islamic world after nearly 3 centuries of division. One of his most audacious commissions, in 1168, was a minbar built by the master carpenter Al-Akarini that Nur ad-Din ordered would be placed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem when he finally gathered the strength to take the holy city for himself. Throughout the 1150s and 60s, the idea of returning Jerusalem, the third most holy city in Islam, began to swell in Zangid domains, with poets and scholars petitioning the ruler to take the city with bellicose messages such as "fight until you see Jesus fleeing Jerusalem" and "banish the worshippers of the cross from Al-Aqsa." Speaking of Jerusalem, things were not going well for the Crusaders. Infighting had broken out between the rulers of Jerusalem, and the Count of Tripoli in 1152 had become the first casualty of the assassins. Although the port of Ashkelon was claimed during campaigns to provide better shipping routes to and from the Crusader states, this action only provoked Nur ad-Din and escalated Seljuk attacks on Crusader territory. Changing tack, he turned his attention to Crusader heartlands in Jerusalem and Tripoli, putting pressure on the remaining kingdom and its border states, and threatening the already vulnerable remainder of Christian power in this region. I'd like to briefly pause the action here to explore another vital side of the Middle East in this period. Having just heard the way that the Crusader kingdoms and Seljuks clashed, you'd be forgiven for believing that the two sides were at complete odds with each other, and communication between the two faiths had broken down in light of the fighting. Oddly enough, though, this wasn't the case across the board, and despite the fighting going on between the two sides, trade between the Christian and Islamic worlds was still very buoyant in this period. The fighting as a result of the Crusades hadn't quelled the demand on both sides for rare goods from Asian and African trade routes, such as silk, spices, and exotic woods, as well as gold, salt, and ivory, coming from the oasis towns of Western Africa. These goods came into major trading cities, such as Cairo, Alexandria, Algiers, Tangier, and Jerusalem, and were traded by a variety of intermediaries between the two powers. Italian merchants from Amalfi in Venice traded with merchants in Cairo, for example, and Sicily and North Africa, around towns such as Tangier and Algiers, enjoyed a lively exchange between each other. For many of these merchants, following religious decretals to the letter that outlawed trade with each other would have resulted in a pretty serious loss of profit, and so exchange continued. One merchant, a man of Mecca named Ramish ad-Sirafi, became famously wealthy from selling spices and silk to Christian merchants bound for Europe, to the point that he was able to donate a black Chinese silk cover for the Kaaba and replaced the Kaaba's silver waterspouts used for wudu, or ritual ablution prior to prayer, with ones made of solid gold. These trade routes could be fiercely defended, and although each side was quite happy to attack each other's armies, merchants were considered strictly non-combatants. We even have examples in our sources of Islamic armies launching retaliation against those who attacked Christian merchants, and vice versa in the Crusader states, to ensure that these lucrative trade routes remained buoyant even during the fighting. With luxury goods came the trade of scholarly texts too. Islamic writings on astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy made their way to the emerging universities of Europe, such as Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, where they were translated into Latin and helped fuel the rise of these institutions as centers of learning in the Christian world. Even then, scholars in Europe were keen to access the wealth of learning that the Islamic world provided. We have evidence of individuals moving to the cities of Al-Andalus, as European universities were frustrated by slow progress and frequent intervention from the church, who wanted to ensure that teachings didn't border on what they considered to be heresy. There was even a degree of curiosity and respect for the Islamic world at this period. The Quran was translated into Latin in this period, and discussed by theologians in universities, and knights returning from the Middle East are reported to have spoken of the Seljuk skill as soldiers, lamenting that if only they had converted to Christendom, they would be fine additions to their own armies. This, taken as a whole, was one of the strange realities of the Middle Ages in general, that clashes between political elites didn't mobilize an entire territory to fight the other side as a whole, and it was entirely possible for the merchants of two opposing sides to continue trade to ensure that warfare didn't impact their bottom lines. Now, on the subject of trade, it is at the wealthy hub of global exchange of Egypt that our narrative continues, as both sides attempted now to take control of the wealthiest and best connected region of the Islamic world, and to bolster their wealth and influence. Having taken Ashkelon, and hoping to make some gains after 20 years of setbacks and threats from the Seljuks in the north, the Kingdom of Jerusalem turned their focus to the other major Islamic power of the period, the Fatimids of Egypt. By 1163, as I'm sure you'll recall from our last episode, the First Shia Caliphate had degenerated into what we might charitably describe as a political hot mess. The head of state was a young boy named El-Adid, and the title of Caliph had been stripped from his position, having only the title of Wali, meaning heir or successor, roughly speaking. The state was also churning through wazirs at an extremely fast rate, with no incumbent holding the office for more than 9 months before being deposed or murdered. It's also worth noting that Egypt in this period was a vital trading hub that connected a variety of extremely wealthy land and sea routes together, such as the Silk Roads in Asia, the Saharan routes to West Africa, and overseas trade with the Zanzibar coast, where all sorts of fascinating goods could be gleaned, such as ambergris, a strange perfume taken from the innards of sperm whales, rock crystal, exotic woods, and gold. As a wealthy and politically fragmented power, they were therefore a major acquisition target in the eyes of Jerusalem, who hoped to expand their influence and wealth to other parts of the Islamic world. Starting in the 1160s, therefore, raids into Sinai and the Egyptian coast began, as Crusader kingdoms sought to establish its presence. Nur ad-Din was initially reluctant to get involved in the situation in Egypt. He intended on preserving the strength of his armies for the ongoing campaign in Syria and Palestine, and felt that an intervention in Egypt would only strain his resources. His advisors were quick to warn him, however, that remaining indifferent to Egypt could result in a Crusader takeover of one of the Islamic world's richest trading and agricultural hubs. His chance to step into the politics of Egypt came when a man named Shawar, one of the Fatimids' many short-lived wazirs, came to the Zangid court, requesting help to be reinstated to power. To help Shawar, Nur ad-Din sent a relieving force under the command of Shirkuh, a Kurdish general and veteran of the Syrian campaign, whose forces included a number of talented soldiers, including Shirkuh's nephew, a promising young horseman by the name of Yusuf bin Ayyub. Shirkuh made short work of the divided Fatimid army and set up Shawar with a sizable base of power in the region. In a shocking turn of events, however, Shawar turned away any further help from Shirkuh and went to Alamrik, king of Jerusalem, asking him to help him instead. Understandably angry when news of this was sent to him, Shirkuh launched a series of retaliatory strikes against Shawar, with the intention of taking Egypt for himself to punish the traitor in his midst. After a year of stalemate in 1167, Shirkuh finally strode into Cairo in 1168, appointing himself Wazir of Egypt. It's said that Shawar was forced to flee through the streets of Cairo, chased by a mob furious that he nearly surrendered Egypt to Crusader hands. Shirkuh was victorious. However, his triumph was to be short-lived. He died, bizarrely, of a fatal throat infection from eating coarse meat. He was quickly replaced by his nephew, Yusuf bin Ayyub, who took over the office of Wazir from his uncle. For Yusuf, however, being an advisor to a caliph wasn't enough, especially one that was so weak, and he was keen to take the entirety of Egypt for himself. He quickly began to consolidate his power and carefully undermined Fatimid control to the point that by 1171, he was able to come to power as a full sultan in his own right. He took the name Saladin, or Saladin, and decided to unify his new territory under a simple but powerful message, that he was the true defender of the Islamic world, and would be the one to drive out the Crusaders for good. It is here that we will end this episode. We might conclude by saying that this period was highly unique, in the sense that politically and militarily, the great succession of caliphates in the early Middle Ages had now been shattered and replaced by military coalitions whose success could wax and wane at any given moment. This was a highly dramatic period, where politics on all levels could be threatened by internal instability and enemies from outside that could take a great variety of forms, from rival coalitions to crusaders to assassins. At the same time, the Islamic and Christian worlds continued to be in conversation with each other, as the appetite of scholars and merchants continued to be fed despite hostilities. This trend continued only further as the period progressed, and in the next episode, we will finish the story of the Crusades from an Islamic perspective, seeing the dramatic rise and fall of Saladin and the introduction of two major new powers to the Islamic world, the successor states of the great Mongol Empire and the Mamluks of Egypt. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.